Within studies of graphic narrative is what they refer to comic books as. There's, from what I understand, a tendency sometimes to go between the viewer, the notions of the audience as a viewer or the reader, depending on what aspect, if you're talking about the image of the text. I'm just going to use the notion of the viewer today, just to keep it simple. And also, I'm talking about the Canadian comic book industry. When I say that, I'm actually talking mostly about English comic books, but the general trends also fit for French Canada. If you're really interested in that, I got some books over here, and you can read up on them. All right, so in the summer of 2011, I came across a remote. There we go. It's not the remote, it's a PhD student. So in the summer of 2011, I came across this photo at the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, and immediately caught my attention. It was the photo of a display of some of the environmental literature distributed by the New Brunswick government in the mid-1970s. The piece of literature that stood out the most was what appeared to be a French-language comic book titled Capitaine Enviro. There we go. An internet search soon revealed that the Halifax-based publisher, Comic Book World, had produced a comic featuring an environmentally themed superhero named Captain Enviro in 1972. This was 18 years before the appearance of Captain Planet, who was often referred to as the world's first eco-superhero. So it had the potential to be what I thought a fairly remarkable research find. I subsequently used the Captain Enviro character as part of conference presentations and lectures over the next several months, and then at AACH 2012 in Madison, I put together this panel with Andrew and Finus. As I prepared for AACH 2013, my paper on the comic book Captain Enviro broadened into an article-length project, from which I hope it will. This paper is thus divided into two parts. The first part examines the context surrounding the emergence of modern environmental values in Canadian comic books, or as I have termed them, eco-comics. From the Second World War until the 1970s, the fate of Canada's comic book industry was inextricably linked to state interventionism. Indeed, the state played an integral role in the rise of eco-comics in Canada, and this is best exemplified by the relationship that developed between the comic book world and the governments of the maritime provinces. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the maritime governments were disseminating environmental information to their citizenries through a variety of means, including literature such as comic books, but they advocated a particular sort of environmental message. The second part of this paper focuses on the implementation of their environmental message through a visual cultural analysis of the images and text in the comic Captain Enviro, produced by Comic Book World for the maritime governments in the early 1970s. So I'd like to begin by addressing the question, time delay. Am I doing this right? There we go, I got it. I'd like to address the question, why comic books? Since the late 1980s and early 1990s, comic studies has developed into a valid academic field in North America. Will Eisner's 1985 book, Comic Sense of Punched Art, and Scott McCloud's 1993 book, Understanding Comics, are generally considered to be the two main works that first helped to establish the study of comics as a serious academic exercise. There are now comic studies academic conferences, peer-reviewed journals, and university programs. Consequently, the study of comics and comic books is considered by many to be an accepted part of visual culture studies. And as Scott McLaughlin has pointed out, comics are, quote, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence, intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, end quote. In other words, comic creators are messengers with specific messages. Analyzing the message of a comic and the motive behind it can thus be a useful means to gain some insight into the larger culture in which the comic was created. Now, the founding of the Canadian comic book industry was the result of the federal government's economic interventionism during the Second World War. The first modern comic book was published in the United States in 1933, yet the medium only gained widespread popularity after the publication of Action Comics #1, which featured the initial appearance of Superman in June 1938. Generally referred to as newsstand comics due to the method of distribution, North American children quickly embraced this inexpensive form of entertainment. Children in Canada, though, were soon cut off from the 100% American-dominated comic book industry. The federal government introduced the War Exchange Conservation Act in December 1940, banning non-essential imports, such as comic books, from the U.S. as part of efforts to prepare the country for war. I think I just need to point to computers. Lasting until 1945, 5 Canadian companies, most of which were based in Toronto, took advantage of the ban and published a range of original comic material. Comic book historian John Bell has called the period from 1941 to 1946 the so-called Golden Age of Canadian comic books. One of the most popular themes of the Golden Age comics was the national superhero. Patriotic do-gooders who battled Nazis with superhuman abilities. The first distinctly Canadian national superhero was Nelvana of the Northern Lights. First issue came out in August 1941. She was also one of the first actual superheroines. She came out before Wonder Woman by several months, actually. And before her, there were a couple other Canadian national superheroes, Freelance and the original Iron Man, but they actually followed American themes, whereas Nelvana was the daughter of an Inuit woman and an Inuit god, but she came out white somehow. Has to do with, anyway, there's a whole thing. The immediate post-war years were tumultuous for the Canadian comic book industry. 2 of the 5 Canadian comic book publishers did not survive the end of the federal ban on non-essential U.S. imports in 1945, while the others recast themselves as reprint firms, or companies reprinting American titles in Canada. From late 1947 to 1951, the federal government reinstated the import ban to protect U.S. exchange reserves, although the new regulations still allowed Canadian companies to reprint American titles. Most of the more than 10 publishers that participated in this branch plant-style reprinting business went bankrupt once U.S. comic books again flooded the Canadian market after 1951. The few remaining publishers also had to deal with an anti-comic book fervor that swept North America in the late 1940s and 1950s. Parent-teacher associations, community groups, and church organizations, spurred on by the 1954 publication of Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent, lobbied for government restrictions on what they perceived to be immoral content in crime and horror comics. Amidst all of these pressures, the last of the Canadian reprint companies folded in 1956. These 2 comics here are from the largest of the reprint that's actually survived until 1956, the Superior Publishers. And this gives you an idea of some of the immoral content that they were kind of considering. Scary stuff like this, and this is a GI war bride supposedly cheating on her man, I guess. Now, the Canadian comic book industry slowly reemerged in the 1960s and 1970s. Newsstand comics did not make a comeback until the publication of Captain Canuck #1 in July 1975. Nevertheless, the Canadian comic book tradition survived in 2 forms prior to Captain Canuck. I love this slide. So, the first form was the underground comics movement, which flourished in Canada from approximately 1967 to 1974. These were small press or self-published comic books that contained satirical, countercultural, and frequently explicit material. This is Beer Comics, the first one was in 1971, I think. That's from Saskatoon, if I remember correctly. Saskatoon was a big center for the underground comics movement, one of 4 in Canada. The second form was educational giveaways, which were free promotional comics commissioned by governments or corporations and often distributed through schools. 2 main publishers produced giveaways in Canada in the 1960s and 1970s, Gaines Productions in Toronto and Comic Book World in Halifax. Now this one here is a 1965 Gaines production comic book that they did for Parks Canada, and I thought the environmental historians might enjoy that. Now, Comic Book World was the brainchild of Owen McCarran. Originally founded as Comic Page Features in 1965, McCarran changed the company's name in 1969. Comic Book World was the combination of McCarran's love for comics, his abilities as a comic artist, and the skills he developed as part of his regular job as an advertising director with the Halifax Herald. McCarran, with the help of his creative collaborator, Robin Edmiston, produced close to 30 original educational giveaways from 1965 to 1981. For example, Comic Book World published 4 comics for the Federal Department of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, which featured the Binkley and Doinkle characters. and inform children about the dangers of household pesticides. I think the folks from Ontario might remember this on local TV back in the 70s and 80s. There were Binkley and Doinkle PSAs, I guess, back then. So in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the governments of the maritime provinces sought out the services of Comic Book World as part of a new environmental messaging strategy. This new strategy was rooted in failed attempts by governments to allay growing environmental concerns through technocratic approaches to resource management and an increased acceptance of the interventionist and welfare state by the end of the 1960s. It was also part of a general change in response by governments, which included the formation of environmental divisions and departments within state bureaucracies. Now, the maritime government's messaging strategy emerged through discussions about greater regional cooperation during the initial formation of the Council of Maritime Premiers in 1971. So right when this comic book stuff was happening, the Council of Maritime Premiers formed, and they created their own sort of kind of superhero symbol. I thought it was kind of neat. It's from the back of a comic, and they're still using that to this day. One of the first subcommittees created under the Council was the Committee of Environment Ministers. After planning meetings in Charlottetown in April 1971, the committee forwarded to the Council a communique which addressed, quote, possibilities, coordination, and integration of effort in the field of environmental affairs. One of 4 proposals in the communique was, quote, cooperations in matters of public education and public relations through common pamphlets, brochures, films, and other types of educational material. Now, the Committee of Environment Ministers used the educational program to advocate a particular sort of environmental message. As stated in the April 1971 communique to the Council of Maritime Premiers, quote, it is important that the public be educated to the true facts of the pollution problem, as opposed to the scare propaganda, which is so common today. The same sort of language appears in the minutes of the 1975 meeting of the Committee of Environment Ministers. When discussing the teaching kits handed out as part of the educational program, one official described, quote, the way in which they may be used in classrooms to give students a better understanding of the environment and the need for conservation and preservation without the use of the scare technique. The committee was thus advocating a more conservative form of modern environmental values to counter what they would have considered to be the radical and even subversive values of much of the emerging North American environmental movement. The Maritimes were highly reliant on a few dominant resource-based industries, so government officials would have been keen to spread a pro-environment message without harboring ill will towards the sorts of industries that form the backbone of the region's economies. Now, this more conservative form of environmentalism is clearly evident in the front cover imagery of an eco-comic titled Anti-Litter Comics. Love puns. Now, this was produced by Comic Book World for the Nova Scotia Department of Highways in 1969, which is probably also where the original idea for the Maritime Premiers was used as well. Now, the main character, Anti-Litter, is a safe grandmotherly figure, and text on the cover invites the viewer to, quote, join Anti-Litter's protest parade, perhaps the most wholesome-looking protest ever. So there's an awesome mingling of sort of anti-litter messages, but also children's highway safety messages here as well. And I love this, the Nova Scotia Department of Clean Highways. They write that in there. So there's some really cool images there that you can do some stuff with that. So, the main eco-comic produced by Comic Book World for the Committee of Environment Ministers was Captain Enviro. Aimed at youth in grades 7 and 8, the comic's plot begins millions of miles from Earth on the planet Polluta, where the strange inhabitants thrive on every form of pollution. Now, it turns out the planet has begun to show signs of cleanliness, a death sentence for the pollutions. So, King Sewage III, this nice character here, dispatches 3 experts from the Royal Pollution Filth Force, Officers Sludge, Smog, and Slime, Sludge, Smog, Slime, to Earth. The planet, here, the planet most likely soon to become polluted. And of course, where are they going to go? The Maritimes. Right? One area that is way behind in pollution is the disgustingly clean and beautiful maritime provinces in Canada. Start there. Right? So the aliens land their spaceship of all places near Fredericton, New Brunswick. And for the remainder of the comic, Captain Enviro battles the pollutions in various locations around the Maritimes, eventually defeating them and saving the day. Now, I'm not skipping ahead here, and you're not going to get to see some cool images. You will be, but this is where visual culture stuff comes in. Now, I see here at least 5 main interrelated components to the environmental message of the eco-comic Captain Enviro. The first one is the chosen means of delivery. As numerous comic book historians have noted, the comic book medium co-evolved with North American youth culture in the late 1930s and 1940s. By the early 1970s, comic books had been immensely popular with youth for over 3 decades, on and off at various points. So it's not surprising that the Committee of Environment Ministers decided to use this medium to reach individuals in junior high. The second component is the generally wholesome content of the comic book. One online blogger has commented that Owen McCarran's early comic art is, quote, very reminiscent of the 70s. I thought of Frosty the Snowman, end quote. There was also no real graphic violence in Captain Enviro. Instead, the creators used 1960s Batman-style visualized sound effects to portray fight sequences, as you can see up here on your left. Both of these elements were intended to make the comic book popular with parents, and probably some element of the anti-comic book fervor of the 50s that was still remembered as well. As part of this push for parental acceptance, Captain Enviro even contains a strong anti-drug message. At one point, the Pollutians drug Captain Enviro with a magic mind pollutant, and he embarks on a crazed polluting spree. Very reminiscent of themes in the 1936 film Reefer Madness. So you can see here, he's like, yeah, let's go pollute. And they're all like, now you're talking, let's go do this. And then he starts polluting later on, and the kids are like, what are you doing, Captain Enviro? Pollute, pollute. It's great. Now, another component is the actual character, Captain Enviro. Clad in a slick sanitation worker's uniform, of all things, Captain Enviro's powers include great strength, a pollutant-free eco-belt that enables him to fly, and an uncanny ability to find any items he might need to fight the pollutions. He at one point finds a dump truck full of clean soil written on the side and dumps it on one of them and kills them. It is significant that the comic's main character is a superhero. In his book, Champions of the Oppressed, Christopher Murray has equated superhero comics with wartime propaganda. Quote, like superhero comics, the function of propaganda was to make its audience recognize certain values and endeavors as heroic, and therefore admirable, and to submit to certain modifications of behavior or belief. One of the easiest and most efficient ways to do this was to offer the audience a model of behavior, usually in the figure of a hero with whom the audience could identify. End quote. Captain Enviro thus serves as a model of environmental behavior for the viewer, and an ideal to live up to, a hero to emulate in day-to-day living. Now, the fourth component is the evildoers, the Pollutians. By portraying the main source of pollution as alien beings, the comic's creators invoke a sense of otherness and externalize the problem of pollution. This is important for 2 reasons. It allows for the delivery of a pro-environment message without any discussion of the true sources of pollution, which fit perfectly with the more conservative form of environmental values advocated by the Committee of Environment Ministers. This process of externalization also engages the viewer without directly accusing him or her of being involved in actual polluting activities. And the final component is a focus on the individual as solution. This is effectively the larger message of the whole comic book, and in many ways, all of the other components culminate with this last one. It is an emphasis on what the individual viewer can do to help save the environment, rather than any sort of focus on structural problems within society. This lack of critique makes up the crux, or is the crux, of the Committee of Environment Ministers' wish to avoid scare propaganda. The comic's creators reinforce the focus on the individual through the inclusion of eco-definitions, eco-quotes from the Maritime Environment Ministers, and a "you can help save" list of pro-environment actions. The comic book even concludes with Captain Enviro stating to the viewer down here, quote, "These pollution invaders are gone for good, but their evil work can continue unless each and every one of us is constantly at work trying to make the maritime provinces land, air, and water pollution-free." Good timing. So the emergence of modern environmental values in Canadian comic books was part of a larger transition in how the state responded to growing concerns about the environment in the 1960s and 1970s. Governments, though, used eco-comics to advance their own environmental agenda. One intended to counter what they considered to be the radical views of some elements of the North American environmental movement. This agenda is perhaps best summed up by one of the eco-quotes in Captain Enviro. On page 4 of the comic, New Brunswick's Minister of Fisheries and Environment, Bill Cockburn, is quoted as stating, quote, "There is no reason development cannot be compatible with proper environmental protection." The maritime governments wanted to address public concerns about the environment, but not at the expense of the region's resource-based economies. Thus, the message of Captain Enviro focuses on individual actions and avoids critical discussions about the possible root causes of environmental problems. As one blogger exclaimed, quote, "If only all society's problems could be blamed on grotesque space monsters." Thank you.